Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. As historian James McPherson says in his magisterial Civil War history, Battle Cry of Freedom, Nathaniel Lyon emerged in the summer of 1861 as the North's first war hero. With little help from Washington, Lyon recruited, equipped, and trained the army that helped to secure much of Missouri for the Union. His men had seized control of St. Louis, the state capital, and much of the state's great rivers. They had sent secessionist leaders fleeing to the southwest corner of the state, and now Union troops were hard upon their heels. Today we conclude with Lyon and his bold efforts with his collision at Wilson's Creek. We begin by looking at the three federal columns that I described earlier as they converge upon southwestern Missouri. There, Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard was joined by Confederate regulars under Ben McCulloch. Next, we'll cover the brief engagement near Carthage between Franz Sigel's Federals and Southern troops amassing south of the Spring River Valley. And finally, we conclude our third week at Wilson's Creek, which witnessed the first major Civil War battle in the state and one of the most important battles nationally in the whole first year of war. The Union Army's victory at Boonville cemented federal control of the Missouri River and rail networks in central and northern Missouri. Although this denied secessionist leaders access to the fertile recruiting grounds there, Lyon still needed help to fully execute his plan to intercept and destroy the rebel forces that had retreated southward. He had the edge for the moment, but he needed reinforcements of men and supplies to consolidate his early gains. By July, federal troops had entered Missouri from the east, north, and west. This is probably an obvious point, but it's important to remember. Much of the fighting that's about to happen will not only pit Missourians against Missourians, but also men from beyond its borders. Union troops poured into Missouri from Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and other northern states, and they would fight the Missouri State Guard as well as Confederate volunteers from Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, and elsewhere. The letters that these men began to write to family back home made clear what motivated them from a very early point in the war. The Kansas troops who moved through Kansas City under the command of Samuel Sturgis, they wrote of the need to preserve the Union, to punish traitors, and to restore national honor. Some of Sturgis's men were career soldiers. Others were recent volunteers heeding the president's call for troops. In their letters, few of them mentioned slavery, and I think this reveals how many Northerners looked upon the war in its early stages. This, as Lincoln had said, was a fight to preserve the Union. Later, of course, it also becomes a struggle to destroy slavery, but we'll save that story for later in the course. This is also a useful moment to recognize the local ties that many Civil War soldiers on both sides describe. Many of these volunteer companies were recruited and organized locally by prominent community leaders. These men within their companies knew each other, and they knew each other well. When they departed from home, they were often presented with a company flag presented by the women of the community. These flags, as Bill Piston and Richard Hatcher explain in their masterful book on Wilson's Creek, they carried a kind of ritual significance as a social contract between soldiers and their communities. Under this contract, soldiers pledged to uphold their community's honor and good name, and citizens back home promised to support the troops and to care for their families in their absence. Nathaniel Lyon's pursuit had the unintended effect of concentrating Confederate troops in the Southwest. In that corner of the state, the Missouri Guard under Sterling Price joined up with Confederate troops under General Ben McCulloch. McCulloch was a former Texas Ranger and a veteran of the Mexican War, and he had been put in command of rebel troops in Arkansas and charged with defending Indian Territory, which eventually becomes the state of Oklahoma. Events to his north, though, quickly preoccupy him. On June 26th, Confederate authorities authorized McCulloch to enter Kansas or Missouri should the circumstances warrant such a move. He chose to wait. McCulloch was not terribly impressed with the state of rebel volunteers in Missouri or their commander, whom he did not trust. The Missourians, he believed, were poorly trained and even more poorly equipped, with some men lacking any guns or ammunition. On July 5th, federal troops under Franz Sigel encountered part of the Missouri State Guard near Carthage. This was part of the Guard still under the command of Governor Jackson. And although they were poorly armed with some men wielding shotguns or hunting rifles or even less than that, the rebels badly outnumbered the Union men. Sigel, though, chose to attack. The Guard soon outflanked him and forced the Federals to retreat back to Springfield. This skirmish at Carthage was hardly big enough to describe as a battle, but as news of the engagement reached Lyon, it strengthened his belief that more support was necessary, and he called upon John C. Fremont, the new Union commander in St. Louis, for help. He asked for more food, more clothing, and at least 10,000 reinforcements. His pleas, though, went unanswered. With their supply lines stretched thin, Union troops had turned to foraging from the local countryside, and as they did so, discipline broke down. Many men fell victim to chronic diarrhea or typhoid, and the makeshift hospital in Springfield quickly filled up. Fremont in St. Louis had concluded that federal troops were needed elsewhere, such as southeastern Missouri. There, the rebel incursion threatened a Union base at Cairo, Illinois, near the junction of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Confederate troops under Gideon Pillow had landed at New Madrid and there joined 6,000 Missouri State Guardsmen under M. Jeff Thompson's Army of Liberation. Fremont feared that if Cairo fell, the whole West might soon tip towards the Confederates. And so Nathaniel Lyon was on his own. His army was outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. They were in poor physical condition, and their morale was fragile at best. The 90-day enlistments of half of his men were about to expire. It seemed that a strategic retreat back to St. Louis was his only reasonable option. This was not a satisfying option for the man whose aggressive moves had already won so much for the Union in Missouri. Lyon couldn't quite bring himself to give up southwest Missouri without a fight. So he resolved to attack the rebels before they could attack him first. We pick things up in the summer of 1861 now, after the Battle of Carthage, and I'm thrilled today to be at Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. And I'm thrilled to have with me here at the Ray House, John Sutton, who is the Chief Park Ranger at the battlefield. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
We've talked about Nathaniel Lyon's advance into southwest Missouri and how the Southern forces had retreated into the corner of the state. What does Lyon do when he's faced with the decision of whether to engage the Southern troops or to retreat back towards St. Louis, as John C. Fremont encourages him to do?
Well, Lyon holds a council of war with his commanders, and to decide what they want to do. And Lyon is very reluctant to abandon southwest Missouri without a fight. They've come this far. There are many pro-Union citizens in the area, and it's just not in his nature to retreat. So they decide on the best course of action, and that is to go ahead and try to attack the Confederate camp down here, give a surprise attack, and try to do as much damage as possible so they can retire to Rolla in relative safety. Lyon was faced with a number of decisions to make. Many of his soldiers their enlistments were expiring. He was at the end of his supply line. Supplies could not hold out much longer. And in retreating to Rolla, he feared that the numerically superior Confederate cavalry would harass him every step of the way. So the decision was to come down and do battle and try and damage the Confederates as much as possible.
Whenever the forces engage here, what do you think are the key turning points?
Well, I think there's two key turning points. One is the defeat of Sigel's column on the south end of the battlefield. That advance had caused a lot of confusion amongst the Southern forces. And so when Sigel is defeated, now the Southerners can focus all their attention on Lyon on Bloody Hill. And the other turning point, I think, is the death of Lyon. For a brief period of time, there's a void in leadership until the Union commanders can assemble, decide what to do, and then move on. So those are a couple of things that I think help determine the outcome of the battle. You have other factors in terms of numbers, weaponry, terrain, these type of things that do play a role in how the battle was conducted.
I'd like to touch upon both of those points. First, why do you think that why do you think that Sigel proposed dividing the forces, and why did Lyon go along with that decision?
Well, trying to use my memory here. Sigel, Lyon was concerned that Sigel was a very popular commander amongst his forces. He felt that if he did not give Sigel an independent command, it was kind of like, well, I'm darned if I do, if I darned if I don't. If I let him have his independent command and things are successful, everything's good. If I don't and give him his command and things go bad, then Lyon could therefore be blamed for not listening to the advice of Sigel. So I think, and also, even though he is dividing his numbers, inferior numbers, in the face of superior numbered enemy, the element of surprise, the ability to inflict more damage this way upon the Southerners, kind of appealed to Lyon in some way.
Okay. Let's talk about the Southern forces. How would you describe the relationship between Sterling Price and the Missouri State Guard and Ben McCullough's Confederate regulars?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that the Southern forces here were, as best as be described, a coalition army. You had Confederate forces under McCullough. You had Arkansas State troops under Pierce, and then you had the State Guard under Price. And so you really had three political entities sort of banding together, if you will, to oppose Lyon. And because of their personalities, Price and McCullough, did not hit it off. And so there was some tension there. And Price felt, because of his experience in the Mexican War, being as a successful military commander during that war, also as having the being very popular amongst his soldiers, and it's his state. We're fighting in Missouri.
Sure.
That his priorities should take the lead. Remember, McCullough is supposed to support Price. That was, and protect the Arkansas border. But Price can't do it without McCullough's support. And so a few days before the battle, there was sort of this negotiations that Price places himself under McCullough's overall command in order to consolidate the forces to oppose Lyon.
Okay. Going back to Lyon's death, what impact does that have for the Union men?
Well, first of all, I don't think the average foot soldier knew that Lyon was dead. I mean, he was kind of busy trying to stay alive. Sure. But I think what happens is it disrupts communications amongst the commanders there. Lyon was taking a very active role in being on the front line, directing troops, placing troops, directing where he thought the next attack would be, this type of thing. So he had a very active role in being on the front line and taking a hands-on a leadership role. So I think in some respect, his death, caused a little bit of a void of leadership until Sturgis was named as the successor.
The battle proves to be a Confederate victory.
Well, so they say.
So they say.
So they say.
Where does the Battle of Wilson's Creek fit in the larger story of the American Civil War?
Well, one thing I think, it was very pivotal in determining the fate of Missouri so early in the Civil War. Missouri, being a port state, was coveted by both sides because of the transportation corridors, the rivers, the western trails, and also the natural resources contained within Missouri. Certainly, if you're going to launch an attack on the north and the west, you need to go through Missouri. Same thing if you're going to go south. Missouri is a perfect staging area. So, the Confederate victory here focuses national attention on the crisis in Missouri. Remember that Lyon was the first general officer killed since the War of 1812. And so while the focus had been kind of protecting Washington, the capital in the east, it's kind of a wake-up call for Washington to do something out west, otherwise we might lose it. So in some respects, it has been regarded as an important battle in the first year of the war, in which national attention was focused on the crisis in Missouri. It also shows that volunteers can fight. There's a lot of Army officers who believe that some of these 90-day or short-term soldiers did not have the proper motivation to fight. And here at the battle, yes, you had both regular standing United States troops, but the intensity of the battle on both sides showed that these men would take on danger and would risk their lives and on a very ferocious battlefield.
Do you recall what the casualty figures were?
Well, I'm not. I'm a good rounder when it comes to numbers,
Sure.
but overall, there's 535 killed and something around 2,400 wounded for both sides. That's out of a total number of around, like I said, numbers around 18,000 soldiers engaged.
It's quite a casualty figure for that size.
Overall, I think the Union forces lose about 25% of their men. The casualty numbers are relatively equal, but because Lyon's army is smaller, they have a higher percentage. It's more like around 25%, where the Southerners are about 12 to 13%. Lyon has about 5,400 men engaged, and the Southerners have a little bit over 10,000 men engaged.
Okay. After the Federals retreat to Springfield and then back up towards Rolla, why don't the Confederates seize upon that opportunity to take the momentum?
Well, that's kind of the whole story of the Confederacy and the Civil War. You win this victory, and then the follow through falls short. And I think a couple of things. We have to remember the men were exhausted. They're out of ammunition. If you are the victor, you typically clean up the mess afterwards. You had all these wounded and suffering men in Springfield. And so and fighting in the summer is very taxing on the men. So afterwards, they didn't have the reserves to push forward, both in men and material. Also after the battle, there's again McCulloch and Price, have a difference of opinion. Price wants to continue to go throughout the state, follow up, and chase the Federals out of his home state. McCulloch's kind of not sure about that. I'm ordered to coordinate with you, but also protect Arkansas. I'm not going to go traipsing across, Missouri with my forces. And McCulloch also understood that, they were low on supplies when they fought the battle. How can you ready to do a campaign throughout the state when you don't have the ammunition and supplies, the food to carry on a campaign? So logistics came into play with that. So there's sort of parting of the ways. McCulloch goes back to Arkansas. Price stays in Missouri and follows up his victory with a campaign which ultimately captures Lexington on the Missouri River. In September,
Okay. The Battle of Wilson's Creek is one of the two largest battles of the entire nation in 1861.
Yes,
isn't that
in
correct?
1861, yes. Okay.
What's the one lesson or the one thing that you hope visitors to the battlefield will take away from their time here?
Well, one thing about the 1861 and the Battle of Wilson's Creek is if you think of what you know about the Civil War, just take it and throw it out the window. We often think of Johnny Red and Gray and Billy Yank and Blue, and that there was clear motivations on both sides. And Wilson's Creek has a lot of unique stories about it, coming from many different angles. Like the Southern Army was a coalition army. You had Missourians fighting Missourians. Lyon had both Missouri volunteers, and so did the Missouri State Guard. You also have some pretty interesting personalities, like Lyon. The whole campaign, was largely directed by the lion's personality. Okay,
Bold,
a bold
aggressive.
personality, a bold, aggressive personality. And then in terms of like uniforms, equipment, weaponry, that's kind of plays a role. I mean, you had Union soldiers dressed in blue, Confederates, Union soldiers dressed in gray, and Confederates dressed in blue, and they had a lot of soldiers who just wearing farm clothes off their backs. So it's a very, very different type of battle. And you also had, and this is another thing I find very interesting about Missouri, is that some of the people who are fighting for the North were slave owners. There's a lot of pro-Union slave owners who did not side with the South and went along with the North, and that type of thing. So that's what I find so interesting about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray and shades in between.
Sure, like Missouri, it complicates a lot of our assumptions.
It's a very complicated story with a lot of interesting characters, and it's interesting the way it was conducted and came out.
Very good. John, thank you for your time
Sure.
today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no bad.